The wind carried the scent of rain and earth across the dry plains that evening, the kind of wind that whispered warnings through the bones of old wooden fences and rattled the windows of every house in Hollow Creek. The sun had fallen behind the far hills, painting the clouds with streaks of bruised purple and gold, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. Folks in town said that whenever the sky looked that way, something was bound to change before morning. Elias Brandt stood on the porch of his ranch house, a tall man built of silence and dust, the kind of man who'd seen more storms than he could count, and weathered them all without flinching. They said he feared no man, no beast, and certainly no woman. But the look in his eyes that night, the way his hand lingered on the brim of his hat, suggested otherwise. He had lived alone for years now, ever since the war took most of what was good in him. The ranch, wide, lonely, and half-wild, was all he had left. Every morning he woke before dawn, fed the horses, mended the fences, and pushed the herd across the fields until the sun burned the skin off his neck. Work was his only comfort. Talking never came easy to him, and kindness, though not foreign, was a habit he'd learned to bury deep, down in Hollow Creek. People still whispered about him when his boots thudded against the saloon floor, or when his shadow crossed Main Street. Some said he was cursed. Others said he just didn't have room left in his heart for anything human. But one thing they all agreed on, Elias Brandt feared nothing. Not thunder, not blood, not even the law, until she arrived. She came to town on a pale gray horse, dressed in a simple linen dress that had seen better days. No one knew her name at first. She didn't speak much, only asked the innkeeper if there was a room for the night and if the church still stood on the hill. Her eyes were soft but steady, and when she smiled, rare as that was, it made people uncomfortable, like she saw more of them than she should. Elias first saw her the next morning at the general store. She stood by the barrels of flour and lamp oil, reading a notice about a church gathering pinned to the wall. The light from the window fell across her hair, catching a faint reddish glow in the strands. Something about the stillness of her posture, graceful yet unyielding, drew his gaze and held it. He told himself it was nothing. Just curiosity. But as the days passed, he noticed her again and again, fetching water at the well, walking through the fields at dusk, or sitting alone at the edge of the river with a book she never seemed to finish. The town called her the quiet one, but children followed her at a distance, and old women watched her like they remembered something they couldn't name. One evening she came up to his ranch. Elias was fixing a broken gate when he saw her riding up the hill, her hair loose, her face calm in the dying light. She didn't ask for permission to approach. She just stopped a few feet away and said softly, "You've got wolves around your property." He looked at her, squinting. "I know. They circle at night," she continued, glancing toward the dark ridge. "They're not hungry. They're restless," he frowned. "You know a lot about wolves." Her eyes met his. Enough to know they're drawn to people who carry something wounded inside. It wasn't what she said. It was how she said it. Like she knew him. Like she saw through the armor he'd spent years building. He wanted to turn away, to brush her off, but something in him stilled. He hadn't heard words like that since before the war. Not since the last time someone had dared to look him in the eye and speak the truth. That night, when the wind began to howl through the ravines and the cattle grew uneasy, Elias found himself lighting an extra lantern. He didn't know why. He told himself it was for the wolves. But part of him, some quiet, forgotten part, was waiting. Just past midnight, a knock echoed through the cabin door. He opened it, half expecting the sheriff or a drifter in trouble. Instead, it was her, the quiet one, her face pale, her hands trembling from the cold. She said there were noises near the river, something moving through the brush, and she'd felt eyes on her since sundown. Without a word, Elias handed her his coat and led her inside. The fire was low, crackling soft against the silence. She stood near it, rubbing her arms, her gaze wandering over the rough-hewn furniture and the rifle hanging above the mantel. "You live alone," she murmured. He nodded. "Always have." She tilted her head slightly. "That's a choice, not a punishment." Elias looked at her then, really looked. "Sometimes it's both." For a long moment neither spoke. The air between them thickened with the weight of unspoken things. Fear, loss, something close to recognition. Then she smiled faintly, though her eyes stayed distant. "You're not what they say you are." "What do they say?" he asked. "That you fear nothing," she said softly. "But fear isn't always in the face. Sometimes it hides in the heart." He didn't answer. He didn't know how to. She had stepped closer now, close enough that he could see the faint scar beneath her left eye, the kind that told a story without words. "You should stay till morning," he said finally. "The wolves won't bother you here." She hesitated, her hand resting on the back of a chair. "No," she whispered. "I can't stay," Elias frowned. "Why not?" Her gaze flicked toward the door, then back at him. "Because they're not after me. What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low, rough. She smiled again, but it was a sad, knowing smile. "You'll understand soon enough." And just like that, she turned and left, disappearing into the darkness beyond the porch. Elias stood there long after she was gone, the wind carrying her scent and the sound of hooves fading down the hill. He waited for her to return, but the night remained empty. Only the wolves answered, their howls cutting through the stillness like a prayer gone wrong. By dawn, the church bell in town tolled 3 times, a signal used only for warning. The pastor rode up the hill soon after, his face pale, his voice shaking when he spoke. "They found her horse," he said, "down by the river. But not her." Elias felt something cold settle in his chest. The wolves were gone, the sky gray and heavy with coming rain. He said nothing, only turned his eyes toward the ridge where the river ran, and the trees whispered secrets he wasn't ready to hear. For the first time in years, Elias Brandt felt fear, not for his life but for what he didn't understand. And somewhere in that growing silence, as thunder rumbled across the valley, he knew the story wasn't over. She wasn't gone, not yet. Something had begun that night, a reckoning maybe, or a promise, and it was coming for him, slow and certain, like a shadow that refused to fade. The wolves would return. So would she, and when she did, he feared nothing in this world would ever be the same again. The storm broke the next evening. Clouds rolled in heavy and low, dragging shadows across the plains until the hills vanished into mist. The wind howled through Hollow Creek, bending the cottonwoods and driving every man and beast into shelter. Elias worked through it, as he always did, but his thoughts weren't on the fences or the herd. They were on the girl who'd vanished by the river. He hadn't told anyone about her visit that night. Not the sheriff, not the preacher, not the hands who worked the lower fields. Something about her words had rooted too deep in him to share. "They're not after me," she'd said. Those words gnawed at him like an unseen wound. He didn't know what she meant, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face in the firelight. Calm, knowing, and a little sad. The preacher's warning still echoed in his mind, too. The horse found near the river. No footprints, no struggle. Just the animal standing still, reins dragging in the mud as if waiting for someone who'd never return. Folks in town started whispering the old stories again, the ones about the land around Hollow Creek being cursed. They said the valley didn't take kindly to strangers, but Elias wasn't the kind of man to believe in curses. He believed in weather, in hunger, in work. Still, that night he found himself walking toward the river long after the others had gone to sleep. The lantern in his hand flickered in the wind, casting trembling light over the reeds. The air smelled of wet earth and ash. He followed the riverbank until he reached the spot where they said her horse was found. The mud still held faint hoofprints, half washed away by the rain. Beside them was something else, a small pendant, half buried in the dirt. He brushed it off and turned it over in his palm. It was silver, shaped like a crescent moon, worn smooth by years of touch. He slipped it into his pocket and stood still, listening. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled. Another answered. But there was something different in their calls that night, a rhythm, almost human, as if they mourned. When Elias returned to the ranch, the fire had burned low. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and sat by the window, staring out into the dark. Sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the wind made him think of her, of that last glance before she disappeared into the night. By morning, word had spread that a stranger had come into town asking questions about Elias himself. A man in a black coat, with eyes sharp as flint and a voice that carried authority. He'd been seen near the old train depot talking to the sheriff, and some said he carried papers from the state. Others whispered that he wasn't law at all, just someone with unfinished business. Elias didn't like attention. He'd built his life to avoid it, but now he felt the walls closing in. He knew something was stirring beneath the surface, something that had little to do with missing girls and much to do with old sins buried in this land. That afternoon, as he was mending a fence, he saw the stranger ride up. The man was clean-cut, city-looking, his horse too fine for this part of the country. He stopped a few yards away, removed his hat, and called out, "Mr. Brandt?" Elias straightened, squinting. Who's asking? Name's Harlan, the man said, dismounting. I've been sent to find someone. Young woman, early 20s. Rode into Hollow Creek last week. You seen her? Elias didn't answer right away. He studied Harlan's face, steady, polite, but there was something off in the man's eyes. Too alert, too knowing. Why are you looking for her? Elias asked finally. Her father sent me, Harlan said easily. She ran off from home. Thought she might come here. Had some notion about finding someone who could tell her about her mother. Elias's jaw tightened. Her mother? The man nodded. Name was Clara. Died up this way some years back. Something shifted in Elias's chest. Clara. It was a name he hadn't spoken in more than a decade. One that carried too much memory and regret. You knew her, didn't you? Harlan asked quietly. Elias looked away. A long time ago. Then you understand why her daughter might come, Harlan said, his tone turning careful. She was looking for answers. Elias's hands clenched around the fence post. He didn't like how easily the man spoke of things that weren't his to say. You won't find her here, Elias said flatly. Harlan studied him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. If you do hear anything, I'd appreciate word. He tipped his hat, climbed onto his horse, and rode off toward town. When he was gone, Elias stood there a long time, the name Clara echoing through his thoughts like a ghost's whisper. She'd been his before the war, before everything fell apart. He hadn't known she'd had a child, or maybe he had once and buried the thought the way he buried every pain that ever came too close. That night, the storm finally broke for good. The rain came hard and cold, flooding the fields. Elias sat by the fire, the pendant in his palm, turning it over and over. He thought of her, the girl, and her words. They're not after me. Something in him told him she wasn't gone. That she'd left for a reason. Maybe she'd known this man Harlan wasn't who he claimed to be. Maybe she'd known what he carried. He couldn't rest until he found out. Before dawn, Elias saddled his horse and rode toward the ridge. The rain had turned the trails to rivers of mud, but he followed the path along the river, where the earth still showed traces of passage. Hoof marks, faint, but there. They led deeper into the woods where the trees grew thick and the air was cold enough to bite. He found signs of a camp, a burnt-out fire, footprints, scraps of torn fabric. Someone had been there recently. Someone who'd left in a hurry. Then just beyond the clearing, he saw something carved into a tree, a crescent moon etched deep into the bark. Elias felt a chill slide down his spine. The same mark as on the pendant. He pocketed a scrap of fabric, white linen, stained with mud, and turned back toward his horse. But before he mounted, he heard it again, the low, distant cry of wolves. Only this time it was closer. Too close. The forest went still, the air thick with tension. Elias drew his revolver and waited. A shadow moved between the trees, then another. But when the first shape stepped into view, it wasn't an animal. It was her. She was pale, soaked from the rain, her dress torn, her hair matted with mud, but her eyes were clear, steady, almost fierce. I told you not to come, she said softly. Elias took a step forward, lowering the gun. You're alive, she shook her head faintly. Alive isn't always the same as safe. He wanted to ask her 100 questions, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. She was frightened, not of him, but of something else, something that seemed to watch them from the woods themselves. They're coming, she whispered. Not wolves, not men either. Something between, Elias frowned. What are you talking about? But before she could answer, a branch snapped in the distance. Then another. The sound moved fast through the trees. She stepped back, her voice low but urgent. You have to leave this place now. He shook his head. Not without you. Her gaze softened just for a heartbeat. You can't protect me, Elias. Not from this. Then she turned and ran into the trees before he could stop her. Elias shouted her name, though he still didn't know what it truly was, and started after her. The woods swallowed her up, and the rain blurred everything into gray. He chased her through the undergrowth until the trail vanished completely, leaving only the echo of her footsteps and the faint, haunting call of the wolves rising somewhere beyond the ridge. By the time the storm cleared and dawn broke again, there was no sign of her. Only the carved moon marks appearing one after another along the trees, leading deeper into the wilderness. And as Elias stood there, soaked to the bone and staring into the mist, he realized something had shifted in him. The fear he'd tried to bury was back, not the fear of death but of what waited in the dark. calling his name. He had no choice now. He had to find her, and whatever hunted her, he'd have to face it too. Because the moment she left that night, Hollow Creek had started to change, and Elias Brandt knew the past he'd spent his life outrunning was coming back with a vengeance. The morning after the storm broke over the hills, the air in Hollow Creek carried a strange stillness. The sky had cleared, but the valley felt heavier somehow, as if the rain had washed away something invisible yet left its mark behind. The cattle were restless, pawing at the ground. The birds, which usually filled the dawn with sound, were quiet. Even the dogs refused to leave the porch. Elias rode back into town that morning, mud splattered up to his knees, the silver pendant tucked in his coat pocket. He hadn't slept a wink since seeing her in the woods. He wasn't sure if what he'd seen was real or some fever dream born of guilt and exhaustion, but he couldn't shake her words. They're coming. The streets were nearly empty. Most folks stayed indoors when things didn't feel right. In a place like Hollow Creek, people had learned to trust silence as a warning. The black-coated stranger, Harlan, stood outside the sheriff's office, speaking in a low voice to two deputies. He stopped when Elias approached, his expression calm but watchful. "Morning, Brandt," Harlan greeted, as if nothing were wrong. "You look like you've been out in that storm longer than sense would allow." "Maybe I was," Elias said, dismounting. "You still looking for that girl?" Harlan's lips curved slightly. "Always. You seen her?" Elias hesitated, then lied. "No sign." The stranger studied him for a beat, then nodded. "If you do, tell her her father's worried. She's in more danger than she realizes." "What kind of danger?" Elias asked. "The kind that follows bloodlines," Harlan replied, "and the kind that doesn't stop until it's settled." He tipped his hat and walked back toward the saloon, boots clicking on the boardwalk. Elias watched him go, uneasy. There was something cold and deliberate in that man, like he was carrying more truth than he let on. He turned toward the church next, drawn by the sound of someone sweeping the steps. It was old Mrs. Calloway, the widow who'd lived there longer than anyone else in town. She squinted up at him. "You look troubled, Elias." "Maybe I am. You found something out there, didn't you?" she asked softly. Elias glanced toward the hills. "You ever hear of a woman named Clara?" The broom stopped mid-sweep. "You'd best not say that name too loud." "Why?" "Because that name carries weight in this town," she said. "Clara wasn't from here, not really. Came through 20 years ago with eyes full of questions and a past she wouldn't share. Stayed long enough to fall in love and long enough to lose everything." Elias's stomach tightened. "Lose everything how?" Mrs. Calloway sighed. "Her husband disappeared in the mines. Folks said it was an accident, but no body was ever found. A few months later, she left town with a child and a warning that the land here was cursed. Never saw her again." Elias's pulse quickened. "What kind of curse?" The widow lowered her voice. "Something about a debt owed to the land. Said Hollow Creek was built where it shouldn't have been, on ground that wasn't ours to claim. She believed the earth remembers, that it comes to collect." Her words echoed through him long after he left the church. He'd never been one for superstition, but everything that had happened, the wolves, the marks the girl, made him wonder as he rode home. He noticed something strange, faint symbols carved into the fence posts along his property line. Crescent moons just like the pendant. Someone had been there during the night. By the time dusk fell, Elias had decided he couldn't wait. If he wanted answers, he'd have to find her again. He packed his rifle, a lantern, and some food, then rode toward the northern ridge, following the old path that led through the woods. The trail was overgrown, branches clawing at his coat, and the deeper he went, the quieter it became. It felt as though the forest was listening. After hours of searching, he came upon an abandoned cabin near a creek. The roof sagged, the door hung crooked, and weeds grew through the porch boards. Yet the ashes in the fire pit were still warm. He dismounted, stepping carefully, listening for movement. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and smoke. A blanket lay folded on the floor, and near it, drawn in ash, was another crescent symbol, larger this time, with strange lines circling around it. Elias crouched, touching the markings. "You left this for me," he murmured. A voice behind him said, "No, I left it for them." He spun, rifle raised. She was standing in the doorway, soaked again from the rain, eyes burning in the lamplight. "They'll be here before moonrise," she said. "You shouldn't have followed." Elias lowered the rifle but didn't put it away. "You keep saying that, but you won't tell me what's coming." Her voice shook. "Because you wouldn't believe me." "Try me." She took a slow breath. "My name is Honora. My mother was Clara Brandt. The name hit him like a hammer. He stumbled back, staring. "That's not possible." "It is," she said quietly. "You left before I was born. She told me you were dead. But when she got sick, she said if anything happened, I was to find you, because what was chasing her would come for me next." Elias felt his throat tighten. The room seemed to spin. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know she had a child," Honora nodded slowly. "You weren't meant to. She wanted to keep you out of it. But whatever took my father in the mines, whatever haunted her, it doesn't care about blood or distance. It follows the name." Lightning flashed through the window, throwing her shadow against the wall. Elias stared at her face, seeing Clara's features in every line. The same eyes, the same quiet strength. "Why come here now?" he asked. "Because it's waking again," she said. "The wolves aren't wolves anymore. There's something older, and the man who calls himself Harlan, he's part of it. He's not looking for me to save me. He's looking to finish what was started." Elias frowned. "What are you talking about?" Honora stepped closer, her voice trembling but steady. "The land here, the valley, used to belong to an old tribe. When the settlers came, they took the land and the silver in the mountains. The tribe cursed those who stayed, saying their bloodlines would feed the earth until it was balanced again. My mother thought the curse died with the old ways, but she was wrong." Elias swallowed hard. He'd heard stories like that as a boy, but never believed them. Now standing there with thunder shaking the cabin walls, he wasn't so sure. Before he could speak, a deep growl echoed outside. Not the sound of an animal, but something heavier, sharper. The air itself seemed to tremble. Honora's eyes widened. "They've found us." Elias moved fast, blowing out the lantern and pulling her toward the back door. They slipped into the rain-drenched woods, the darkness thick and alive around them. Behind them came the sound of snapping branches and low guttural snarls. They ran until their lungs burned, reaching the ridge where the land dropped into the valley below. Elias turned, gun drawn, scanning the shadows. He saw movement, shapes shifting just beyond the trees. But when the lightning flashed again, there was nothing there. Honora caught his arm. "You can't fight them the way you fight men." "Then how?" She looked down the slope toward the river, where the mist curled like smoke. "The answer's in the mines," she said. "That's where it started. That's where it has to end." Elias hesitated, remembering the tunnels that had collapsed years ago. The ones that had swallowed Clara's husband. No one went near them anymore. He nodded grimly. "Then that's where we're going." They descended the hill, the rain easing to a steady drizzle. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. The earth seemed to hum beneath their boots like it was waiting. By the time they reached the entrance of the mine, dawn was breaking. The old wooden beam stood rotted and crooked, the air seeping out cold and metallic. Elias raised the lantern he'd brought, lighting the path inside. The tunnels were silent except for the drip of water and the faint echo of their footsteps. As they went deeper, Elias noticed marks on the walls, more crescents, carved by hand long ago. Honora whispered, "She came here once. My mother. She said she saw the truth carved in the stone." What truth?" Elias asked. But before she could answer, a voice echoed from the darkness ahead, calm, steady, and too familiar. "Some debts," it said, "aren't meant to be forgiven." Elias froze. Out of the shadows stepped Harlan, his coat glistening with damp, his eyes unreadable. "I told you, Brant," he said softly. "The past always finds its way home." The sound of footsteps filled the tunnel behind him, many footsteps, too many to count. And from the darkness beyond, something else began to move. Elias raised his rifle, but Harlan only smiled. "You can't kill what was never alive to begin with." The air grew colder. The lantern flame flickered, fighting to stay lit. Honora's hand tightened around Elias's, and deep in the mine, something ancient began to stir. Elias didn't know if it was the curse, the ghosts of the land, or the sins of his own blood. But as the ground shook and the darkness pressed closer, he knew one thing for certain. There would be no turning back now. The reckoning his family had been running from had finally come home. The air inside the mine was thick and heavy, filled with the scent of rust and damp stone. Every breath Elias took scraped against his throat. The small lantern flickered weakly in his grip, throwing long, trembling shadows against the tunnel walls. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep inside, slow and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock counting down. Harlan stood just ahead of them, the faint glint of metal at his belt, and that calm, unwavering look in his eyes. Honora stayed close beside Elias, her hand clutching the pendant she'd worn since the night she'd first appeared at his ranch. The silver crescent caught the light in flashes, glowing faintly like it remembered something older than either of them. "Why are you doing this?" Elias asked, his voice rough but steady. Harlan smiled, though it never reached his eyes. "Because this land demands balance. Your family took what was never theirs, Brant. You built your life on ground that was meant to stay untouched. You think curses are stories, but curses are just promises made in blood." Elias frowned. "You talk like you were there when it happened." "I was," Harlan said simply. His voice didn't rise, but something in it made the skin on Elias's neck tighten. "I was here when the first miners broke the sacred ground. I saw the earth open. I saw what was released, and I've been watching ever since, waiting for the line to come full circle." Honora stepped forward, her voice trembling. "If it's revenge you want, take me." "Leave him out of this." Harlan turned to her slowly, his expression unreadable. "You don't understand. It isn't about revenge. It's about the debt your mother left unpaid. The bloodline doesn't end until it's finished." Elias's jaw clenched. "You stay away from her." He raised his rifle, but Harlan didn't flinch. "You think bullets matter?" the man said softly. "The ground beneath you is older than iron and harder than your pride." Then the lantern flame sputtered once and went out. Darkness swallowed them whole. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the sound of breathing, and then a low, resonant hum began to rise from the stone walls themselves. It was deep, steady, and alive. Elias could feel it in his bones. The floor trembled beneath his boots, and the air grew colder with every passing second. Honora gripped his arm. "It's starting," she whispered. "What is?" he asked. "The awakening," she said. "The land is remembering." A faint red glow seeped from the cracks in the tunnel walls, pulsing like veins beneath the earth. Elias caught glimpses of movement in the shadows, shapes shifting, slithering, crawling where no living thing should move. The sound of claws scraped against stone. Harlan stepped back into the light of the glowing earth, his face pale and almost inhuman now. "Do you feel it?" he murmured. "It knows you, Elias. It's been waiting for you to come home." Elias pulled Honora behind him. "We're leaving." "You can't," Harlan said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You're part of it now, just as Clara was." The mention of her name hit Elias like a blow. He turned on him, rage burning through his fear. "You stay out of her name," he snapped. "You didn't know her." Harlan's lips curved into a small, bitter smile. "Didn't I?" "She came to me when the nightmares began. She begged me to make it stop. I told her the only way to stop it was to finish it, but she ran. She thought she could hide the child. She thought she could hide you both." Honora's breath caught. "You're lying." "Am I?" Harlan said quietly. "Ask him. Ask your father why he left before you were born." Elias froze, the words striking deep. "I didn't leave because I wanted to," he said hoarsely. "I left because the mine was collapsing. Because the men I worked with, your mother's husband among them, were gone before I could save them. I didn't even know she'd survived." Honora's eyes filled with tears. "She thought you were dead." "I was supposed to be," Elias said softly. "But I crawled out. And I never came back." The ground shuddered violently, cutting through the moment. The tunnel ceiling cracked, showering dust and pebbles. Somewhere in the darkness a howl rose, long, low, and not quite human. Elias shoved Honora forward. "We're leaving now." They ran deeper into the tunnels, the red glow following like fire under the earth. Behind them, Harlan's voice echoed through the dark. "You can't run from what you are." They sprinted until they found a side passage that sloped downward, narrow enough that Elias had to turn sideways to fit. The air grew colder still, and the walls began to shimmer with veins of silver ore. The light from below grew brighter, shifting from red to a strange pale blue. Honora stumbled to a stop. "This is it," she whispered. This is where it began. The passage opened into a vast cavern. The floor was uneven, the ceiling lost in shadow. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, cracked but solid, surrounded by strange markings carved deep into the ground. The same crescent symbol was everywhere, on the floor, the walls, even on the altar itself. Elias stepped forward, raising the lantern's wick to coax out the last bit of light. "What is this place?" Honora's voice trembled. "A burial ground. The tribe that lived here before the settlers. They used this place to seal away what they called the Earth Keeper. My mother said the miners opened it when they broke through the first shaft. They thought they'd found silver, but it was something else." "What did they find?" "The curse," she whispered. Before Elias could speak, a voice rose from behind them. a calm, steady chant in a language he didn't understand. They turned, and there was Harlan standing in the mouth of the tunnel, his eyes glowing faintly in the blue light. "You can't stop it now," he said. "It's already awake." He raised his hands, and the markings on the floor began to glow brighter, forming a ring of light around the altar. The ground shook violently. Cracks split open, releasing bursts of pale mist. Elias pulled Honora back as the air filled with whispers. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, layered voices that seemed to speak from the stones themselves. "Help me break it," Elias shouted, his voice almost lost in the noise. Honora dropped to her knees beside the altar, her hands trembling as she reached for the pendant. "This was made from the silver that sealed it once before," she said. "If we can return it, maybe it'll hold again." Harlan's voice rose above the storm of sound. "You can't seal away something that was born from your own blood. You are the key, both of you." Elias fired his rifle at the ground between them. The bullet sparked off stone, sending shards flying. "You talk too much," he growled. But Harlan didn't move. He only smiled, cold, unflinching. "You think this ends with me?" The earth split behind him, and from that dark fissure came a burst of light so bright Elias had to shield his eyes. The whispers turned to screams. Shapes poured out of the crack, shadowy figures twisting and reforming, their outlines flickering like fire and smoke. Honora cried out as one of them lunged toward her. Elias swung the rifle like a club, striking through it. It dissolved into mist but reformed instantly, whispering her name in a voice that wasn't human but still carried something heartbreakingly familiar. Her mother's. Elias froze. "Clara?" For a heartbeat, the figure took her shape. Soft eyes, the same faint scar below her left eye. Then it twisted again, pulling away into the darkness. Honora's tears streamed down her face. "She's part of it now," she whispered. "They took her soul when she tried to escape." "Then we're getting her back," Elias said fiercely. The cavern began to collapse. Rocks fell from above, water pouring in through the cracks. Harlan stood within the glowing circle, the light wrapping around him like a crown. "The debt must be paid," he roared. Elias grabbed Honora's shoulders. "Do it now. Use the pendant!" She hesitated, her hands shaking as the ground trembled harder. The blue light turned white, blinding, pulsing faster and faster. The whispers became a single, endless scream. Elias looked around. The walls were splitting, the air burning cold against his skin. He pulled Honora close, shouting above the chaos, "You have to finish what she started. Whatever it takes!" Harlan's voice cut through the roar. "Once it's sealed, you'll never see her again." Honora looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "Maybe that's the price," she whispered. She lifted the pendant high above the altar, the silver glowing like molten light. The markings around them blazed to life, the earth shaking so violently Elias could barely stay on his feet. The sound that followed wasn't thunder, it was deeper, older, like the world itself crying out in pain. And as the light swallowed everything, Elias caught one last glimpse of Harlan's face twisting into something monstrous, his voice echoing through the collapsing cavern. "It's too late to stop what's been awakened." The ground gave way beneath them. Elias reached for Honora, but the light consumed them both, and the world fell silent. Only the echo of her name remained, drifting through the dust and darkness, as the mind sealed itself shut once more. When the dust finally settled, silence filled the air like a heavy fog. The echo of the collapse faded slowly, replaced only by the faint dripping of water somewhere deep inside the earth. Elias lay motionless on the cold stone floor, his body aching, lungs burning as he pulled in a sharp breath. For a moment he thought he'd gone deaf. Everything sounded distant, muffled, unreal. Then, as the ringing in his ears eased, he heard her voice. "Elias," Honora whispered weakly. He turned his head, pain shooting through his shoulder. She was lying just a few feet away, covered in dust and trembling but alive. Relief washed over him so fast his eyes stung. He crawled toward her and helped her sit up. The glow that had once filled the cavern was gone now, leaving only the faint light from the cracked lantern that had somehow survived. The markings on the ground had faded into dull gray, the altar fractured down the middle. "It's over," she murmured, her voice hoarse. Elias looked around, uncertain. "I'm not sure. It's quiet, but..." He paused, feeling the floor beneath them. It was solid now, no tremor, no hum, no whispers. Just stillness. "Maybe it really is." Honora clutched the pendant, now dull and cold. The silver crescent no longer glowed. "It stopped after I placed it," she said softly. When the light came, I felt something leave me, like the curse was pulling itself back into the ground. Elias looked at her with quiet awe. "You did it," he said. "You sealed it again." She shook her head, tears forming. "We did it. If you hadn't stayed, if you hadn't believed." He gave a small, tired smile. "I didn't have much choice, did I? You Brant women have a way of dragging men into things bigger than themselves." She laughed faintly through the exhaustion. "You sound like my mother." At the mention of her, silence returned between them. Elias reached out, brushing the dirt from Honora's hair. "She's at peace now," he said quietly. "I know it." Honora nodded, her eyes lowering. When the light came, I heard her voice. "Just for a moment," she said. "You're free now." Then she was gone. Elias helped her stand. The air was clearer now, though the cavern still smelled of stone and iron. They found a narrow passage that hadn't collapsed, and with slow, careful steps, they made their way through it. Their lantern flickered, lighting only a few feet ahead, but that was enough. The deeper they went, the more the air began to change, less heavy, less damp. Hours passed before they finally saw a faint, pale light up ahead. Elias quickened his pace, his heart hammering. When they stepped out into the open, the night sky stretched wide and endless above them. The stars shone brighter than he'd ever seen, and the air smelled like sage and dust. They both stood there for a while, breathing it in, the first clean air after what felt like a lifetime underground. Dawn crept up slowly over the hills. The orange glow spilled across the plains, touching the broken fences, the wild horses grazing far off, the lonely outline of the old ranch house in the distance. Elias and Honora started walking toward it, their boots crunching over dry soil. When they reached the porch, Elias pushed open the door. The house smelled of old wood and ash, just as it always had. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through the cracked window. Everything felt both familiar and changed, as if time had moved differently for them. Honora sank into a chair, silent for a while before speaking. "What happens now?" Elias looked out the window at the land stretching endlessly before them. "Now," he said, "we live. We take care of this place the way it should have been cared for. We let the past rest." She turned the pendant in her hand, thoughtful. "Do you think the curse could ever come back?" He considered the question carefully before answering. "Maybe, but not in our time. You sealed it with something stronger than silver or prayer. You sealed it with forgiveness. That's not something the earth forgets easily." Honora smiled faintly. "My mother always said the land remembers both kindness and cruelty." Elias nodded. "Then maybe it'll start remembering the good again." They spent the following days rebuilding what little they could. Elias fixed the fences, cleaned the stable, and cleared the debris from the porch. Honora tended to the small garden behind the house, planting herbs where weeds once grew. There was something healing about the routine, each task grounding them, connecting them back to the living world. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of gold and violet, Honora joined Elias on the porch. He was whittling a small piece of wood, the way he used to when he needed to think. She sat beside him and watched quietly. "You never told me why you came back after all those years," she said. He smiled faintly, still carving. "Because the land called me back. Same way it called your mother once. I kept dreaming of it. The hills, the old well, the mine entrance. I thought it was guilt. Maybe it was something more." "Maybe it wanted you to finish what she started," Honora said. He looked out at the fading horizon. "Maybe. Or maybe it just wanted to be forgiven, same as us." The evening wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a long, low sound that faded into the hills. It didn't feel haunting anymore. It felt like a part of the land's song, familiar and alive. Weeks passed. The mine remained sealed, the ground above it covered in fresh soil and wildflowers. No strange tremors came, no whispers echoed at night. The ranch began to feel like a home again. One morning, Honora found Elias standing by the fence line, watching the horizon. He looked peaceful, the hard lines in his face softened by the rising light. She joined him, following his gaze. "There," he said quietly, pointing toward the distance. A herd of mustangs ran across the ridge, their manes catching the morning sun. "They never used to come this close. Guess they know the land's safe again," Honora smiled. "Maybe they always did. Maybe they were just waiting." He looked at her then, something warm and steady in his eyes. "You remind me of your mother when she first came here. She had that same fire, same stubbornness, Honora laughed softly. You say that like it's a bad thing. He chuckled. Never was. For the first time in years, the ranch felt alive. Not haunted, not burdened, but renewed. The old ghosts had settled, and in their place grew something gentler. Hope, maybe, or peace. That night, as the stars came out again, Honora stood by the window holding the pendant. It no longer glowed, but she could still feel its quiet warmth. She whispered a small prayer, not of fear or sorrow, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the land, for her mother, for Elias, and for the chance to start anew. Downstairs, she heard the steady sound of Elias moving around, preparing coffee like he did every night before bed. The normalcy of it felt sacred. She smiled to herself and closed her eyes. For the first time since she could remember, she didn't hear whispers in the wind. Only the soft hum of crickets outside, the creak of the old porch, and the faint heartbeat of the land beneath her feet. The curse that had once bound them was now just a story, an old wound finally healed. The mine would remain buried, but its lesson would live on. That some things aren't meant to be conquered, only respected. Elias knew it too. He often said that the earth had a way of teaching those who listened, and after all they'd endured, he finally understood what it meant. The land wasn't something to own, it was something to belong to. When morning came, the light poured into the house, warm and forgiving. Elias stepped outside, tipping his hat against the sun. Honora joined him, her eyes bright, her spirit unburdened. Together they looked out across the open plains, where the grass swayed like waves under the wind. For the first time in generations, the Brant land was quiet, not with death, but with life, and somewhere deep beneath their feet, in the heart of the earth that had once groaned with anger, there was only silence. Peaceful, enduring silence, the kind that comes when the past finally lets go, and the living learn how to begin again.